Hi, I'm Jim Clark, Visual Arts Manager here at Hopkins Center for the Arts. We're speaking with Kar-Keat Chong about his exhibition, Impressions of Twin Cities in Ink and Watercolor, on view now in the upper lobby gallery through December 3rd, 2022. Kar-Keat, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Can you tell us a bit about the specific inspiration for this show?
Yes, for sure. So I've been living in Twin Cities since 1999. So there's still a lot of places that I feel I haven't explored because, when you start working, you get the busyness of the life and family and then career development. But I feel like it's a good way to really delve into getting to know now my adopted home city. I started to spend a lot of weekends, partly with Urban Sketches Twin Cities, and then also on my own with a sketch buddy of mine, Tony Cheng. We would just go and explore different parts of the cities that we haven't been, and part of that process is just kind of going to that place and on the weekend, and we just sit there and really kind of take in the place and try to understand what's happening in that area, in the vicinity, what really constitutes to that neighborhood, and start sketching them. And I feel like that's a really great way to see a place and get to know a place is through detailed sketches or painting on location. So a lot of the work here you see are done on location, and actually a few of these are actually done on the same day. It was like a sketch walk, we call it, that we start on in the morning at 9 and we actually ended at 4 o'clock. Like this one, like St. Paul Cathedral, was actually the first one of a sketch walk that we did in St. Paul, along with the ones down there with the Landmark Center and Irvine Park, which it's like a little pocket neighborhood park that we've never seen before. So it was great to just kind of stumble upon these areas as we walk and we would drive. And so a combination of both, and I think that's the best way of getting to know a city.
It's funny that you say that it was a part of your process getting to know your adopted town, because I grew up in this area, and I think when you grow up in an area where you live in a space, it's easy to take for granted all these gems of our community that we see as maybe, well, that's for the tourists, right? But looking at your show, I discovered things about towns that I've been around almost my entire life. So it's wonderful that the work creates that opportunity for people, shining a light on in new ways on familiar places.
Yes, for sure. And also, this is like a selection of a lot of the places I've been and things that I actually have a little bit more connection with. But definitely I feel like this exploration will kind of continue on and just almost venture out a little bit more outside kind of the Twin Cities area even, and some of the suburbs and some little towns outside of the Twin Cities.
How do you select the site in a general sense to start with? And then when you're at the site, how do you decide this more specific micro site within that space to get the perspective you're looking for?
Yeah, and that a lot has to do with kind of the connection that I feel with a certain vantage point. And also a lot of it has to do with, oh, there's a tree here, it's under a shade, I'm gonna get away from the sun. Just practical things like that, but also a lot of it has to do with light, the light quality of a certain place. And for example, again, this St. Paul Cathedral one. So trying to find, because the sun will start to move around quite quickly throughout the day. So finding, usually I kind of do a walk around the site and trying to understand a building or a neighborhood and trying to understand what's the best vantage point and what would be the best view to kind of represent that subject matter.
And it sounds like that process is both conceptual as well as visual. Like you're looking for, is it fair to say that you're looking for an iconic view or a less iconic view? You're talking about getting a sense of the neighborhood, which is conceptual, and then And I was thinking of it more like, well, what's the most stunning view?
Yep.
So, but you're weighing both at the same time?
Yes, that's very true. Like for example, this state capitol, right? I mean, the iconic view is kind of straight up from the elevation of the building. You just see this really majestic quality of the building. But as I kind of start to like, walk around and explore the grounds, I feel like the sides, the side elevations are actually very interesting. So to me, I feel like also in the back of my mind, I always think about design and composition, you know, on a 2D format. How do you really kind of suck your viewers in? You know, how do they really perceive a scene and how they see it, and really kind of get them into it and feeling as if they're there, right? So I like to explore certain vantage points that might not be what typically everybody would see. You know, come up, you take a picture, and you know that's what it is. So I always like to kind of be a little bit more thoughtful about my process. Think about, okay, what are other views that might be more interesting and might be more captivating, and things that people might not be seeing. So kind of through my own eyes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is this work the result of, I know that you're involved, if not lead, the urban sketching group in the Twin Cities?
Yeah, so I was used to be an administrator, one of the administrators for the Urban Sketches Twin Cities. So I help organize a lot of events, and that also part of the process, you know, that coming out and getting out and sketching. Even a lot of this work was done kind of after pandemic starts, when there wasn't a lot of, we haven't had any group activities. So it was only me and my sketch buddy Tony, and two of us would just go out on our own and keep exploring. And during that process, we really actually kind of assemble a list of all the places that we think that once the world opens up, we can have sketching outings at these locations. So it's kind of a combination of both. Like through Urban Sketcher Twin Cities, I get to know some of these places, but also through some of my own explorations, we added more venues where we can have these
kind of scouting.
Essentially, scouting, yes, we are scouting.
Pre-fishing.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the fishing guys.
Yeah, because it was a great time to do that during pandemic, and when there's only a few of us, and we can just kind of get around the cities and very fluidly, you know, move from one place to another and test out these locations even before we have the bigger group. Because now the group has grown to about 1,200 members.
1,200?
Yes, so it's getting really big, and we consistently are getting 40 to 50 people showing up for these sketch meets. And we used to have it only once a month, third weekend of the month, but now we're having it midweek as well. So there are multiple opportunities within the month that people can show up and sketch.
With urban sketching, it seems like, and maybe this is nothing, maybe this is only coincidence, but it seems like there's an avoidance of the term plein air. Is there a difference between working plein air and working as an urban sketcher?
To me, I don't think there's a really clear distinction between the two. I think there are plein air artists that's also joining urban sketching. I think urban sketching has just become a little bit more informal, that it doesn't have to be a perfectly finished product. You know, it could be a vignettes of different scenes that you're seeing, that you're feeling, decomposed on a piece of paper. So I think I always feel like it should remain fluid between the two. If you feel like you're at a place, at a scene, you're looking at it, and you are really, it feels like it warrants a really beautiful painting and sketching or something, you can do that still. So I think should remain fluid.
Are all of the works on display, were they done in situ? Were they on site? None are studio works.
Right. Yeah, so majority of the work here are done on locations, except some of these bigger ones, the 30 by 18s, because of the sheer size of the rice paper. it gets really tricky to try to work on them on location, the wind and everything. And so I always usually I would do some vignette sketches, thumbnail sketches that would kind of help me go back to the studio and compose more of a final painting.
Cool.
Yeah.
Could we take a look at some of your materials?
Yeah,
your
for sure.
mediums?
Yeah. So the work on display here is all done on rice paper. So it's a very thin medium, but it's also very tough. But when it gets wet, it gets a little softer. So you can see how light and how fluid it is when you apply the color, and because there's not much sizing on these paper at all. So once the ink or the color that touches the paper will start to bleed. So you kind of need to get your values and everything pretty accurate as you apply them. And I can pass these along if you want to feel it. So after the work is done, all this painting and sketches are done. Here's another one. You can feel with the color what that really looks like. Then I actually would wet mount them. And sometimes it gets a little nerve-wracking because it can tear and ruin the perfectly finished painting. So I think that's kind of part of the process that's so unique about it. But once it's mounted, and it actually goes on a substrate paper called masa paper. So it would be wet mounted and then stretch on a board to get them super flat like this. So you can see once it's mounted on the substrate, the color pops so much more. It becomes so much more vibrant when it's just the rice paper where it remains kind of a little translucent. So I can pass it around too, so you can get a feel of what that's all about.
What type of adhesive do you use to do the wet mounting?
It's actually just wallpaper gel, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my father-in-law, who's a very famous watercolor artist, and he uses this process for a lot of his paintings as well. So he has researched a lot of these wallpaper gel product, and he found this that he really likes, and basically comes in powder form, and then you just mix it with warm water. And it's almost completely transparent. It has a little opacity to it, but it's not enough to distort the color and the ink.
Is it also reversible?
Yeah, you can actually soak these in water a little bit, and you can actually pull it apart. So I've never tried before, but maybe I should experiment because it might come up with a different effect that you never know, right? So I mean, that's part of the process. So it will be kind of cool to try that someday.
Related to process and medium process, do you begin with any pencil underdrawings, or are you working directly in ink and watercolor?
Most of the, unless it's a really complicated perspective, then I would actually do pencils, because what I don't like about pencil undertone on it is because you cannot erase the lines on the rice paper. You actually start to pull the fiber off the surface of the paper. So I usually, even sometimes like the smaller pieces like these, I would use the back of the fountain pen. And by the way, a lot of these were done with this fountain pen. So it's a bend nib fountain pen. So the tip is actually bent. So what's so interesting about this is like depending on the angle, it would flow better than the other. And also depending on the angle that the line is drawn, you create different line weights. So if you flip the fountain pen around like this, you can get really fine lines. It's almost
upside down.
Upside down, because the ink is flowing a little slowly backwards. So you can get really fine lines. So I use that to sketch out a lot of perspectives. Like, you know, when there's a bunch of windows, I usually draw the top and bottom line so I can have a perspective lines to follow, and then just draw the windows and flip it backwards. Yeah, so that actually works out really well. And then you can just remain using just one pen for the whole thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is it a fairly linear process where you draw in ink and then you do the watercolor wash over the top and it's always that, or is there sometimes some back and forth between the ink tool and the watercolor?
Yeah, sometimes I would do the ink, and But I don't do all the ink right at the first pass. So I would actually do that and then color and then see how it feels overall. And then I'll come back and add more ink as I need to, just to kind of give the sketch or painting a little bit more pop in terms of value.
Sure, sure. Do you work in other mediums?
I starting to dabble a little bit in gouache and acrylic, and part of it is I really enjoy the texture of those mediums and the opacity. I've always worked in watercolor and ink, so it's been a little refreshing, but I also like to kind of challenge myself and try different things and see what else within the water medium there's any other possible combination that creates a more interesting effect.
Do you keep a studio practice running concurrently with your on-site urban sketching plein air work?
Yeah, so I have a working studio where I still practice architecture. So I have really dedicated spaces in my studio when I do my architecture and my painting, because it's great just able to leave the work out and just kind of let it breathe, as I call it. And come back and reflect on it and improve on it or move on to other pieces. So it's really nice. And I have a lot of pin-up space in my studio, so I put the stuff up all the time so I can see them collectively, where the direction I've been taking, and also trying to try to be self-critical about some of the work I'm doing. So it's been good.
Tell us about that self-critical process. What questions are you asking of yourself and the work to know where to go?
Yeah, and sometimes because I do a lot of architecture, so built environments and subject matters as buildings have become more natural to me. It's something that I automatically attracted to. But also trying to think about spatial relationships is kind of what I've been lately getting into, trying to understand, besides the facade, how do I make it even more three-dimensional in the two-dimensional medium, right? And what kind of abstraction can I pull out from that? So that's kind of some of the questions I've been kind of dabbling with. And does that really going to start leading into more of a semi-abstract art kind of a direction? I'm not really sure. But there's also just like, I'm just really interested in this architecture phenomenology of spaces. So the atmosphere quality of spaces, the light, and everything's still kind of floating out there for me. So trying to almost explore and find other ways to convey some of the ideas in my painting.
Sure. Yeah. How much additional mark making, moves, tweaks, adjustments do you do after you're back in the studio? Or do you get them done on site and full stop and step away?
Yeah, usually, like again, these are really examples that once they're done on site, when I feel it's good enough, I usually don't go back, because I really like to preserve that quality, that it was all done on site. There's no afterthought, so it remains fresh, almost like off the site in a way. So it's refreshing to me that way, to keep them in that form. Yeah.
We should open up to questions. Do you have any questions?
Yeah.
So once the wallpaper paste is, I'm assuming it's brushed onto the back of the piece.
Yeah.
Without ruining, I guess, in essence, your piece, because the watercolor is gonna wet. How do you get it flattened out without?
Yeah, so the way it's done is that the paste, so we flip the painting over. I usually have a plexiglass surface that I flip it over, and I apply the gel. I usually start in the middle, and then I work my way out to the corners, and then slowly working out all the air bubbles.
So kind of a straight thing?
Actually just a brush, a really soft, like a 4-inch wide goat hair brush and a hake brush. Just slowly kind of pushing out all the air bubbles. And then I would take the masa paper, the substrate, you just kind of spray some water and to get it a little wet, and then put it directly over the paste painting, and then take like a horsehair brush, like a wallpaper brush that's like usually 12 inches wide, and then again work from the middle and work my way out to all the sides.
So everything's upside down essentially as you.
Yeah, everything is like, I'm not seeing the final product at all, and then I put the paste around the edges because when I pull it up, it needs to go on the board, and then the glue will hold the piece in place and dry, and when it dries, then everything becomes super flat. So the process of when you pull it up, and then you start to see if anything got pulled or tear, or you start to find it out really quickly. There's actually a piece in the show, a corner was torn off, and I actually have to patch it back after I flip it over. I'm not gonna tell you which one, maybe.
Good idea.
Yeah, it'll be a little scavenger hunt, and but that's the kind of the truth of and the process of this work. And you know, my wife and I always have this conversation. It's like, why do you put yourself through this? I said, this is the only way to really achieve that freshness, because I feel like you can pre-mount the rice paper, and they sell that pre-mounted rice paper on substrates. But because the glue, it's already inherent, right, in between the layers, when you apply the color, it would not bleed. It would not blend at all. You wouldn't get this really softness that you're seeing here. So I feel like, you know, because of that effect is really worth risking the final product. And you know, these smaller ones are not an issue. You know, the bigger ones become an issue, and the longer, because of the proportion, and as you apply the gel, the paper can stretch, and they can tear easily. So, but you know, practice makes perfect, right? You just keep doing it until you're not a problem anymore.
Well, and you've touched on this a little bit in the discussion, but why these materials? How did you arrive at working with these particular tools and grounds? Yeah,
and I like this because I feel like to me is the purest way of just kind of capturing something really quickly and almost a very fresh manner. Because there's not a lot of tinkering with the medium. A lot of it's more emotion, a lot of memory muscle, and you mix the colors, you know what the value, you know, not concerning too much about everything else, but applying colors as you go, and then really just between you and the paper and what you're seeing, and trying to get that down in a really fast manner. And also the ink, I feel like the ink is so definitive in and what it represents, and also playing with positive and negative spaces of on the paper. Right? I don't always just sketch, like a window is a window. Sometimes I sketch the shadow portions of it, and so kind of playing with that implied areas on the paper and the subject matter is always fun to me.
Yeah,
so, yeah, cool.
Can you tell us more about the red stamp and when you would add that?
Yeah, so the red stamps that you see, they are on some pieces, but they are not on all of them. And there's a few, and sometimes I use them and when I feel like a piece needs almost like an anchoring color. Sometimes you know, tie it together, but in a way it's also my mark. Ideally, I would have some that are smaller chops made, and the chop is basically my Chinese name, and it's some smaller ones made that might be more like for the smaller pieces would work better. So unfortunately, this stamp particularly has chipped on the corners, so it has become a little less perfect when you put the stamp on, but you know, it's part of the process, and work with it, right? So, yeah.
Mark?
I'm curious how you organize the image you look at a blank piece of paper and you're looking at the world. There's a lot of detail in here. How do you organize what's going to appear on the paper? You know, kind of the mechanical process of, do you outline it? Do you just, how do you do it?
Yeah, I usually I usually just really start out just kind of get the big shapes down, right? Because like, you know, St. Paul Cathedral, okay, the dome is kind of the top, so that's kind of my limit, right? So that really defines the overall scale of the building. So usually start with the tallest part of my subject matter, and then kind of rough out all the shapes, the general big shapes first, and then I'll come back and fill in the details. And then some of the colors that I use start to define the details as well, so I don't have to sketch everything in fine detail, because the rice paper, the ink bleeds quite a bit, so that mark, in a way, start to kind of define my thought process as well, where I lay them. So I always try to be, you know, not over ink them, get the rough shapes down, do a little bit of the details, and then do the colors, and then come back and add them as I need to. If that answers your question. Yeah.
I don't know that much about fountain pens, and I was wondering if you started out with fountain pens, and if there's different types of fountain pens, as opposed to ballpoint. Have you used ballpoint pens also? And then a little follow-up to that is, what type of ink do you use in your?
Sure. Yeah. Usually, when I first started out, I do a lot of just kind of the felt tip pens. They're usually waterproof because I know I want to color over them. And then through Urban Sketchers group, I've seen people start using fountain pens a lot in their sketches, and then I start to kind of get into it a little bit more and trying to figure out what are all the options. There's definitely a lot of almost like tutorial or review videos out there by fellow urban sketchers that would share the pens they're using, the tools they're using. So, and I just started buying these pens. They're Sailor, they're Japanese brand, and these actually come in two angled nibs, and I was really intrigued about this bend nib. I was like, what is this bend nib? What is this so special, right? So I bought it and I just try it out, you know, and I really like how the different line weights you can achieve with one pen, because in a way it's almost like a brush, you know, because brush, if you push down, you can get wider lines, and then if you use the tip, you get finer lines. So I just started kind of getting into it, and then really kind of felt attached to this particular pen. The ink I use is platinum carbon ink, so it's a Japanese. It's waterproof. It's really great, and I use a cartridge, a converter in there that I can just, you know, refill the pens all the time, and then also it does kind of there's sustainable quality to it. You know, I'm not throwing out a big plastic pen every time the ink runs out. So I love just having that. And I usually have 3 or 4 of these because they run out quite quickly, especially with the rice paper. It just absorbs so much of it. The ink just kind of flows. Like, especially the State Capitol one. That one, I think it took like 7 or 8 refills, because there's so much detail in that one. And like the Target Field one too took so much ink because it just flow, because there's so much line in it. Yeah, and I've tried ballpoint pens, and I usually would have, lately I found this one, Sharpie has a almost like a ballpoint pen now that's waterproof. I usually have in my pocket that I would use, and just little pocket sketchbooks. If I see something interesting, that I would just use that to sketch really quickly, because it's also have a click that you just kind of, the tip comes out, and you don't have to fumble with the cap, you know. Yeah, so, and then I also like some rollerball pens, so those work pretty well as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I've been involved with urban sketchers for about a year now, and I get to the sites, and especially this more street scenes, I'm overwhelmed with detail. And I have trouble, and Mark kind of touched on the same thing. How do you narrow down what's important to the picture?
I think that's sometimes I still have that issue. It's like there's so much, I want to capture it all. And what I usually would do is at each outing, before I start doing something I really like, I usually do like a warm-up sketch, right? So like that little one of the Gibbs farm that I passed around, that was a warm-up sketch that I would do at the first thing I do on the site. And part of it is like, it narrows everything down for me that, okay, I only now just gonna focus on this thing. I'm not gonna be too overwhelmed by everything else. I'm just gonna draw this one thing. So that helps me leading into the other sketches that I'm doing, that I'm only gonna start small, because less is always better. And sometimes I work in sketchbooks form, but lately I've been doing more sheets. But in sketchbook forms, I always have these, you get a spread to work with, right? So a lot of it that I would just start on one side, and then if I feel like I need to, I can spread over to the other. So a lot of it is, you know, like sometimes I start here, I know this is gonna be contained on this page, but sometimes when I do it, it will spread into, as I start drawing parts of it, and then I think, okay, I'm gonna keep drawing, but then I would stop here, right? So in a sketchbook form, you have a little bit more freedom of what you're drawing, and like even
when
like
you're
this.
doing your warm-up sketch, is that just on a separate sheet of paper?
It can be in sketchbooks too. Sometimes I have a little pocket one, a very cheap sketch, you know, doesn't have to be really good watercolor paper. It's basically just a notebook that I would just do thumbnails on really easily and quickly. And then, yeah. I find that really helpful, because then you're not pressured to have to do something. I'm always pressured by
the time limit. It's 2:30, we're going to look at our stuff in 15 minutes, you know. And
Yeah. I always try, nowadays I feel like, you know, maybe less result oriented and maybe just trying to enjoy the process of sketching. Then it might flow a little easier.
We have time for one more question on camera, and it's this gentleman in the corner, because he's been patiently waiting.
The written statements of the exhibit here were really interesting, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the evolution of your style and your youth. I think you started young with a fountain pen, maybe, and so if you could tell us a little bit about the evolution to get here.
Yes,
and
for sure.
Who influenced you in your life?
Along the way, so I was always very interested in painting when I was young, and my mom thought that, oh yeah, maybe he's got something going on that, you know, so she sent me to learn from two local artists in Penang, Malaysia. That's where I was born, and I grew up. And they taught me really just basic drawing skills, building my drawing foundation, and then gradually getting to paint watercolor. So watercolor is really kind of the main, the most popular medium, I would say, in Malaysia, in my hometown. Tons of watercolor artists. Oil or acrylic is not as accessible in that way. So everybody just kind of stay with watercolor, and just because it's also easy. And Malaysia is tropical, so you can do plein air all year long, and there's so much. And the city I grew up in, Georgetown, it's a UNESCO heritage city. So there's tons of historic architecture, tons of colonial architecture, a lot of Mediterranean influence architecture. It's a British colony, former British colony. So it's rich, and you can see my sketchbooks. There's a series of buildings on one street, it's a temple, it's a mosque, it's a church. So it's just so much, it's a lot of things you can draw without any issue, any day. And I grew up, and after I learned from these artists, they're like, okay, yeah, you got good foundation and you should just keep painting. And I have a group of friends in high school, which belong to an art society, and they're upperclassmen. They're phenomenal watercolor artists, and till today they still are. And we would just go out and do plein air painting and sketching on the streets. And that really help hone my skills, because you got to practice. And it was never really a lot of work was done in studio. We always just do everything plein air just because we can, right? And so the work is always really fresh that way. But after I came to the U.S. For my undergrad, and then I started working, and I really kind of put that away a little bit. I mean, I still sketch and draw in my profession because I'm a practicing architect. So I never really lose kind of the drawing part of it, but I was not doing finished paintings, so to speak. And until I met my father-in-law, and he's a really prominent watercolor artist, and he actually grew up in China, but then he moved to Malaysia when he was 15 or so. And then also really passionate about painting. So he, in a way, we almost kind of went through the same path, and 40 years apart, 50 years apart. And so now he became a really influential figure in almost like my second part of my art life, I would call it. And he just really encouraged me. He said, hey, you got this really good foundation, it'll be a shame not to develop it. And but I felt like my style or my approach hasn't really changed that much since I started, because it's always about trying to capturing that atmospheric quality at that certain moment when I'm doing the work in my paintings. So I think that's always be essential to my work. I think the approach might have changed a little bit in terms of how I'm going to continue and evolve and develop my painting skills and what I'm painting. And it's been good to have my father-in-law, who's very almost philosophical in terms of how he approached painting. There's a lot of kind of Chinese Taoism philosophy that influenced how he approached it. It should be effortless, and I think part of that influenced me in my work. Is like always have to be fresh, it has to be kind of natural, and when you draw something, you kind of need to know the subject matter, and because then it will kind of flow through you and flow onto the paper more naturally. So I think in terms of the style, it might evolve because of the approach, but the idea of trying to capture something as fresh as it can be and more of the atmospheric quality, especially for these kind of plein air on location work, I think it still be essential.
And a quick follow-on.
Yep.
The combination of ink with watercolor. I'm not an art expert in any way.
Yep.
Is that kind of unique in a way to your work, or have you seen that before?
Yeah, I think it's more common, kind of more in my profession, architecture. Before the digital renderings start taking over architecture representation, right? Imagery, it's always been just ink drawings and markers, a really quick light watercolor. So I've always, I think part of it, ink is always essential to my work, is because also I've been doing architecture and I always use ink, and again, trying to draw something really quickly and capturing the essence of something with ink, I feel like it's kind of the most direct approach.
It's super effective.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Kar-Keat, thank you so much for sharing your work with our community.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
We've been speaking with Kar-Keat Chong about his exhibition, Impressions of Twin Cities in Ink and Watercolor, on view through December 3rd, 2022 in the upper lobby gallery.